I'm Chris Marshall. I'm the CMO and Employee Adoption Evangelist at Espressive, and I want to welcome you to our online event on IT service desks aren't meeting the needs of the hybrid workforce. During today's event, we're placing everyone on mute, but we're hoping you'll ask questions. Will really has mentioned already that he loves it to be interactive, so we're hoping you'll ask questions throughout. If you have questions or comments, please place them in the Q&A window, not the chat window. Put them in the Q&A window. We do have people standing by to answer questions as they come in. So now I'd like to introduce the two speakers. So first, Pat Calhoun is a visionary leader with an intense focus on user experience and customer adoption. He founded two companies to date, Aerospace and Espressive. And as CEO at Espressive, Pat is set to transform the enterprise self-service experience to a consumer-like approach that drives employee adoption and significantly reduces help desk calls. Prior to Espressive, Pat served as Senior Vice President of Product at ServiceNow, General Manager at McAfee, and CTO and GM at Cisco. And I'm excited to announce that today's special guest speaker is Will McKeon-White. Will works as an analyst on Forrester's infrastructure and operations team, focuses on modern service delivery. His research helps enterprises understand and capitalize on advances in processes and technologies for more effective IT and business service delivery, including enterprise service management and IT service management, and the use of chat ops and chatbot capabilities to facilitate better help desk and employee support, incident resolution, and IT team effectiveness. So Will, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Golly, I forgot how long that list goes on for. But
too long.
Yeah. But great to meet you all. My name's Will McKeon-White, analyst, as Chris said, analyst on Forrester's I&O team. And today, here to host a discussion on how IT service desks aren't meeting the needs of the hybrid workforce. And so I said today I'd bring data, got a little bit potentially too much. So hopefully won't be a cudgel, but hopefully be interesting. Throughout this conversation, Pat and I will be discussing certain different points, but to kick on off, I do want to also remind you, as Chris just said, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box. We are here to help, and we really want this to be an open discussion. There is dedicated time at the end for Q&A, but if something's of interest of you that comes up in flow, please let us know. So without any further ado or introductions, this is some of what we've planned on talking about today. IT needs to prioritize employee experience. We'll be talking a bit about why EX is actually important and sort of the business reasons behind that. We'll be talking a bit about how IT explicitly isn't meeting the EX needs, the data behind that we've collected. And when it comes to providing for a better employee experience, we've identified a few key technologies to actually improve the experience overall, one of them being chatbots. And so we wanted to talk a bit about how you can actually choose these technologies and understand the market, because my golly, it's complicated. And finally, how do you actually get people to use your platform? Because ultimately success in the space is determined by your users. And so all things that you do should be oriented around their needs. But so without any further preamble, IT needs to prioritize employee experience. So you've probably heard about this term a lot. You might even be gold on employee experience, but by and large, you might not necessarily have gotten a lot of information on why organizations are starting to prioritize this and the actual business reasonings here. Quite simply, employee experience, and that we at Forrester have directly traced employee experience to good and better business outcomes. Better engaged employees result in 81% lower absenteeism, 10% higher customer metrics such as satisfaction, and 23% higher profitability. And if you want more data, well, we got some more. The impact of positive employee experience is very difficult to argue with these days, as 89% of organizations with a higher EX score say their organizations are customer obsessed. They actually provide their customers with what they need. 93% at higher engaged organizations say their employees that actually recommend their offerings, and potentially what's most important to some of your leadership today. At high EX index score organizations, 94% of employees say they plan to stay with their organization for the next 12 months. So significantly lower turnover in high EX organizations. But so that's great and all, but how does IT and by consequence the help desk actually affect employee experience? the first piece to understand here is that technology is the intermediate, and employees do fundamentally want to be productive. Employees are most engaged when they're actually able to make daily progress in the work that's meaningful to them. And so as technology is an intermediary of work, you are effectively ensuring that all employees can be productive today. So you are the key linchpin in ensuring that employee experience actually is, that employees are actually able to make these daily journeys, and that you're actually not actually impeding employee experience today. So your mission fundamentally is to remove any sort of barriers from your employees' productivity, to enable and, unfortunately, not act as a gatekeeper to this productivity. And we're seeing this making real impacts in IT today. As I mentioned earlier, you might already be gold on this. Actually, about 60% of organizations have, or IT organizations have, some degree of goal on employee experience, whether it's a team level or an individual one. But the somewhat distressing counterpoint to this is that only about 28% of IT decision makers report that they're actually collecting this employee feedback today. And so this leads us to our next point. IT isn't meeting employee expectations and employee experience needs today. And I do want to clarify, this is not through lack of trying or lack of effort. 67% of employees, when they interact with the service desk, actually say they're overall very satisfied with the level of service that they're provided. But you are ultimately fighting against a lot of factors outside of your control, which is resulting in these poor experiences that we see here. 62% of employees say to some extent they avoid the service desk, and 58% say they're living with issues the service desk can't fix. To us, that means something is fundamentally broken here. It's not necessarily your fault, but it is ultimately your mission to help fix it.
You know, Will, this is what we call the silent sufferers.
So, yeah, very good point. And we all have had issues where we just don't want to bother somebody as well. And so there's a lot of different factors here. Some of it is because you might not believe that service desk can fix it. Some of it might be because they're disengaged. Some of it might be because they just don't want to bother somebody because they've let their password expire for the third time in a row, which I myself might have done once or twice before. And so there's all these various different factors that are playing into this. And so understanding some of those factors is sort of how we get to this slide, the different automation components that are critical for employee experience oriented operations. So I'm not going to spend too long in this slide just because we could probably talk on this for an hour and nobody wants to hear me do that. But by and large, what's really critical here is that there's all these interconnected technologies that you can use today in order to start improving these experiences and different points in this experience. And we have a slide in just a second breaking down some of those bits. But what's also important to understand is humans aren't necessarily going to be going away in this equation, but organizations do need more self-service to help meet these employee expectations and employee needs. So just a little bit of fun data here in terms of how employees would like to engage. But what's worth noting on this slide is how to read this is the green bit, of course, self-service. The light green bit, I apologize, just realized that I chose potentially conflicting colors there. But in the light green bit, these are instances where somebody would still like to talk with a person. What that should tell you is not necessarily that this is an area where only a person can help, but this is an area where you should be targeting preempting user needs. So fixing a broken device, for example, is a complex problem. Somebody needs to go into depth in articulating this. This is an issue that you can potentially take care of before it even occurs. A password reset, as I talked about earlier, is a little bit of a potentially embarrassing problem. People don't necessarily want to engage with other people to say, yeah, I screwed up again. This is something that they want instead to actually be able to accomplish through a self-service mechanism.
You know, just real quickly. So our experience is just a little bit different in a lot of organizations that we speak to. The outage is the event that really creates a lot of overwhelming number of calls into the service desk. And it actually typically is what causes people to wait on hold for a very long time. What we're actually seeing is that is an opportunity to automate. The problem today is that when people just don't know when an outage occurs. So if there's a more effective way of communicating that, it eliminates the need for people to want to talk to someone.
That's a really good point. And yeah, a lot of that comes down to employee communication, and people want to know why, again, going back to the daily journeys, people want to know why they're being prevented from being, in their mind, productive, from doing their job. And it's, of course, a natural drive here to try to understand what is exactly staying this way. Is this something I can fix? Is this something you can fix? Is this something that we just kind of have to twiddle our thumbs with? But there's a lot of opportunity from organization point of view to reduce down those just massive surge volumes of tickets to help you get ahead of some of these problems. And speaking of that, there's really sort of two components to the improving employee experience overall. To break this down into a sort of two-step action plan that's very complex to do and very easy for me to say, there's two ways to do this. There's avoiding the need for support entirely, really proactive support capabilities there, but also to improve and fundamentally accelerate the support experience, which we'll be really diving into more today.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit of context in terms of the reason why I get excited about this, Will, for everybody on the line. I started my career in the service desk. I know what it's like to be answering the phone day in, day out. I find it really interesting that here we are in 2022, and for many organizations, solving the service desk problem continues to be what we did back in 1992, which is just put butts in seats and have people answer phone calls and emails. So I'm actually really excited about what we're going to be covering here.
Oh golly, because people really do need assistance. And speaking of butts and seats and sort of unchanged support processes, this is a example just of some of what it might be like for an employee to try to get assistance on just an intentionally generic issue here. And this is a very standard experience for a lot of employees. This, of course, adds a lot of work to their plate. They need to figure out how to actually get support from the organization. They need to figure out where they can go to actually to get this assistance, where they can go to request and actually submit that, or where they can go to submit that request, I should say. They need to actually explain the issue potentially multiple times, especially if the issue reoccurs. A lot of organizations don't necessarily have a good way to ensure continuity between these different experiences. And this causes delay. This impedes that daily journey. Each of these squares in orange is a step that the time is, or that the is time where the employee is actually spent from being productive. And many steps just don't need to happen today. We have better ways of doing this, and most organizations should embrace this. You shouldn't necessarily need to go to a specific or 6 different locations to look up where to go to help. You shouldn't necessarily need to wait in a queue. You shouldn't have to resubmit requests. You shouldn't have to recontact L1 on the same issue that you know who needs to assist you with. You shouldn't have to explain the issue in detail multiple different times. And while we do capture metrics in terms of how well the service desk is performing, they usually capture leg performance and don't necessarily capture the total employee impact, which by and large is not that great today. Each one of these bits with the frowny smiley face are areas that really disengage employees. This is preventing them from being productive and isn't something that necessarily needs to happen for them today. And so again, you need tools to improve your service delivery processes. You need to, 1, accelerate the delivery, and 2, reduce systemic issues in your organization.
So Will, quick question for you before we go kind of down into the details of the tools that are possible out there. One of the, I guess maybe we can call it a concern or an objection that I occasionally hear from prospects is, well, my employees expect a white glove service. So the only way to solve this problem is by throwing people at it, because that's the only thing that they're willing to accept. And I'm kind of curious, because in your prior slide where you're showing the process that people have to go to, the level of waiting and so on, how would you answer that?
That's a very good question. And actually, just to go back to the last slide, a lot of organizations say they need white glove, but actually aren't able to provide that today, even though they think that they might be, and that their way to resolve problems is through one-on-one, through really close collaboration with somebody. Ultimately, there's actually a lot of impediments to a good quality experience there that they're probably blind to, because they're not necessarily measuring all the key metrics here that would actually help them understand what is impeding employees' actual productivity and impeding their experience when it comes to the service desk. And so I would say, ultimately, usually why people say they need white glove service is because they want somebody who can stick with them through the resolution of an issue. If you can't resolve that issue with people anyway, well, you should fundamentally seek self-service there in order to help improve that, but also people fundamentally just want to get their issue resolved. That's another area where self-service can improve and can actually accelerate that. It's white glove if they get their issue resolved, in my mind, that they still get the degree of potentially hand-holding and care that they need, and it allows you to actually spend more time on the complicated issues where there isn't necessarily a standard way to resolve a certain problem. Because if something falls into an exception category, you still will need humans in order to help resolve that. And that's a much better experience to be able to take care of a lot of things quickly and then go to humans and actually get to humans quicker than it is to wait in an hour-long queue in order to get some basic resolution done.
Yeah, I have a slightly different view. And a lot of this, I think, is because of my experience when I was at ServiceNow. We built the self-service portal. And having spent time on the service desk. I think one of the reasons is because historically people would equate self-help as a bunch of knowledge articles being thrown at an employee and letting the employee read a bunch of documents in the hope that they can self-diagnose their issue. The reality is most employees don't really know how to express their problem. In many cases, VPN's not working, their laptop's not working. And so anything that sort of resembles a vague statement of that nature will not result in a great outcome if you're just doing a straight up knowledge search. And so this is why I think, and you're going to go into this a little bit more, but this is why people call the service desk, because they expect somebody to engage with them and to get to a conclusion of what the problem is. And so to be successful, you have to be able to take what a service desk agent does today, and you have to find a way to encapsulate that inside a tool.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's, especially when it comes to knowledge, usually when somebody's asking, how do I do XYZ, chances are they want to go and do XYZ. If they say, how do I reset my password, chances are they need a password reset. Fundamentally, just providing a Q&A on that isn't necessarily going to help them execute on that faster and might potentially confuse the process if the knowledge is out of date. So making sure that you have a degree of automation in order to execute on those self-service mechanisms is actually what makes that fundamentally self-service, not self-DIY, liking on a better term in order to describe that. But and just one of my favorite examples of how people don't necessarily know what a specific problem is there was a ticket that I saw a few weeks ago, basically saying, my taco isn't blue, which is a bit of an odd sentence to hear in an IT context, to say the least. But ultimately what the user meant was that their OneDrive was having trouble syncing, because in their mind, it looked like a blue taco. And in this case, I think it was either gray or it had a big red X on it. And their taco wasn't blue. And so they didn't necessarily know what they needed. They actually had to then express to the individual what the context of the ask was. And this took a few minutes in order to resolve. People don't necessarily know what their issue might be. And so you need things that can help them better understand what some of their problems could be and to help guide them to that point of resolution. People can't just be thrown assets and hope that they can better understand their issue, because fundamentally we each think of our own environment, our own productivity in a different way. We have our own terminology for things. That's just how we work. And so planning around that and actually ensuring that people have the assets they need in order to complete those tasks is fundamental for ensuring people can still be productive in your IT environment. And so just before we get into really the chatbot portion of today's talk, or conversational AI portion of today's talk, I wanted to provide some quick upfront vocabulary just to help you understand some things I'm saying, because I'll probably be moving over this fairly quickly. So I have an example sentence here. I'm having trouble logging into my MacBook and my keyboard lost a key. An example of just a common help desk request that might be coming in because somebody's having some computer troubles, to say the least. So when I say language model, that means this is the thing that defines what most words actually mean for a chatbot and their relation in a sentence or utterance. So in the sentence, I'm having trouble logging into my MacBook. It's helping the machine actually understand what each of these words mean, what it probably actually implies as well. A vertically trained language model will have a few additional benefits, like actually understanding a sentence that wouldn't make sense out of context. So like, what is a MacBook? If you just say that word to somebody who doesn't know that a MacBook is a type of laptop, that wouldn't make sense. But in this case, it helps ensure the machine understands this is a specific thing. So that's also an example of an entity. But by and large, it's helping it understand that these are specific things that they might be asked to do, and helps you understand that it's, again, a brand of laptop. And that a key also is another good example of a word that can be potentially misunderstood here, because a key could be a physical thing to unlock it. It could be a actual physical thing on a keyboard. It could be a specific piece of plastic. So actually understanding what a key might mean in the context of a laptop is fairly difficult to go and actually build yourself, but of actually vertically trained language model, it provides that's sort of one of the biggest benefits of that. Then intent is the actual goal of a sentence. So the intent of saying that I need a new laptop is that you want a new laptop and you're seeking to be provisioned one. It isn't necessarily that you're trying to inform somebody else that there's an issue with your laptop. And again, entities, as I quickly alluded to earlier, are effectively nouns with a distinct connotation, ideally specific to your organization. So a MacBook is a specific brand of laptop from Apple. Apple itself is an entity because it's a specific corporation, not just a piece of fruit. And so, so I was just going to say, when it comes to language, there's a lot of potential opportunities for miscommunication, to say the least.
Yeah, and one of the challenges, just being in this business and understanding how complex this stuff is, the sentence that you're showing here is not about helping somebody do a password reset. It's the fact that there's a key that they need to use in order to log in that they don't have access to anymore. And so being able to really understand the full context of the phrase, and not just make assumptions based on the fact that we're seeing there's a login issue here, but it's in fact a physical issue with the keyboard. That is something that requires a fair amount of work in terms of building a language model that it can understand the underlying meaning of that phrase.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's also things like double intent sentences where somebody has two different things going wrong and they say it all in one sentence because they want to provide you information as quick as possible, or they spend an entire paragraph sort of getting to the point, and so you need to sift through that. And so if there's anything that you can take away from this conversation, first, I would say employee experience is important. And the second is that chatbots are hard. And so with that being understood, that this is a very difficult problem to solve, I wanted to provide you a bit better understanding of the landscape that we see, especially at Forrester, and how we've identified the different sort of verticals of offerings here, because there's a lot of them. This is sort of one of my full-time jobs, and it's still difficult even for me. I don't expect anybody else to necessarily be able to spend as much time as I do covering this space. And so hopefully this provides you a little bit of a quick guide in order to understand some of the byways that we've seen established in the market. And also, we're going to be talking a bit about building and buying and the differences there. But so quite simply, what are the different chatbot approaches available in the market today? There's really 4 that we've identified. Technically, there's 5, but it's a sort of discussion for another day. So the main 4 that you'll be running into are toolboxes, very build-oriented. These are solutions that give you all the tools that you need in order to build a fully custom chatbot and to do things like train the language model yourself. These tend to require a significant amount of manual effort, but are extremely flexible, and a lot actually provide you with code level access. A lot of them have a very inexpensive to startup type of model for them, but usually require expenditure when it comes to the actual staffing and investment and time that is spent there. Then there are platform or platform extension chatbots. These are really built to extend out a platform's core capabilities. And so if you're in a large platform and it has a chatbot solution that's used to enhance navigation, to enhance findability, to improve your own capabilities or to improve your user's experience in that specific platform. Usually these have some issues extending outwards, but these can be included in the broader platform agreement. So that's why a lot of folks have chosen to go with some of those offerings. Then there's virtual agents. This is usually a mix of build and buy solutions. These are usually some vertically trained models from fairly advanced language processing capabilities that you can then train to your own specifications and further customize. There's a lot of different permutations of these especially, and there's a few different ways of approaching this, but by and large, how we have sort of shorthanded it is if it comes pre-trained or a lot of out-of-the-box capabilities, it's probably closer to a virtual agent. Then finally, in the space, there's automation aggregators. Similar to the platform approach, these are really pre-trained, pre-made, out-of-the-box, occasionally fully managed offerings that you can quickly purchase to get up and running. In terms of the build and buy continuum, these are furthest closest to the buy side of it, but also usually have the lowest in terms of the actual build requirements. And going back to sort of how we see the market and what we usually recommend, building a chatbot is an extremely difficult endeavor and isn't necessarily anything that we would recommend undertaking lightly. And that's why we built this cost continuum. There's been some misassumptions in the market that if something is free to start with, it'll ultimately be free for the organization and sort of just a net value add. By and large, there's always a trade-off, and there's a lot of hidden costs when it comes to chatbots. First of them being they're difficult. We've seen a lot of organizations struggle with developing their own over the years and have had to totally rethink strategies after 2 years of effort. Fast usefulness, similarly, is required to actually ensure that you meet your ROI goals. There's a long tail of application when it comes to the different ways that people can, especially in the help desk context, actually ask for support. So back to the blue taco problem, you're probably not going to plan on that one, but there's a very long tail of this, and knowing where to stop is a bit difficult, and where you can actually reasonably achieve is even harder. There's interaction-based charges and a lot of solutions, which it makes sense from starting out, but this is effectively a charge for utilization. And so the more success you see, usually the higher cost you get, which leads you to some very interesting conversations with finance managers. There's usually training time involved in any sort of solution. And so that in itself will decrease user goodwill if you are training it for 3 months and it's still not being useful in the user's mind. And you can there's always a market for professional services, and a lot of organizations realize that they don't necessarily have the required skills in-house for a full build solution. Very often, if you are seeking to build it yourself, you'll actually have to hire some experts in the space. And we saw one large US bank do just that, and they ended up having a bunch of senior developers with some AI experience sitting in a room, being paid about $300,000 a year, clicking a button, basically whether a conversation was good or bad. That's a great job if you can get it, but even they were going somewhat insane, just trying to figure out what is a good conversation, because this was fundamentally not necessarily their skill set, and they wanted to be doing something that they saw as potentially more value add rather than just helping facilitate the training of a model. And so in our recommendation and how you can better utilize this in your organization, we recommend that your strategy should seek to minimize language model development and training time. Chatbots scale exponentially in work, and when we say exponentially, it's very hard to stress just how much work can be generated by these, but creating clear limits around your responsibilities as an organization allows you to actually spend time on what ultimately matters here, which is fulfilling your users' requests, and back to what we were saying earlier, to trying to improve the employee experience, especially when it comes to service fulfillment.
You know, Will, one of the motivations for us to put a lot of effort in building a pre-trained language model that specifically understands the employee language. We don't really go after car navigation or anything like that. We're really focused on employee language. And the reason why we believe that there's a lot of value is what we've actually seen through the data is over 87% of what employees ask is virtually the same across every company. So if you look at it from that perspective, rebuilding the wheel when your neighbors already learned it. There's a lot of value in a solution that just learns from the collective, that learns from everything, because the chances are what your employees are going to be looking for doesn't really change all that much from your competitor or some other company.
That's a good point. And just because humans will fundamentally do what is useful to them. We are creatures of habit, and we are subject to the inertia of habit. People will do what they know will actually work for them in order to actually get that support. If they're expecting to be able to get assistance with a fairly simple ask, because that's how they've asked it for, or that's how they've explained this fairly simple issue all of their professional career, and they expect to be able to get support on that fairly simple utterance, you're going to need a spark to change how they traditionally get support, because people do what works. They want to be productive. And so going back to some of what we saw drive employee experience, people want to be able to make those daily journeys, and they will find a way in order to become productive again, even if it's not necessarily the way that you would want. And so in certain instances, we have seen chatbot implementations, conversational AI implementations, or adoption where it hasn't worked, where it wasn't able to prove its usefulness. Users then abandoned the solution, and they started dialing up support professionals in the organization that they knew personally. They would then go directly to them in order to get that support, and actually evaded the other channels because it could not prove that usefulness. This lack of immediate usefulness directly resulted in people actually abandoning it and failing the project. And one other example of this, not that last instance, but another instance where there was some hardship here, an organization spent about 6 months developing their chatbot. They actually had to pull it out of production because it wasn't recognizing enough requests. I think the intent recognition rate, so understanding what somebody was saying, was close to like 60%. Which sounds all right, but then if you think about it, that's about 4 out of every 10 sentences that is typed in, it's failing to recognize what that means. So even within a certain interaction, there was a 50% chance effectively that something would fail. And that as you were describing your problem, it would just.
Yeah, and I think, Will, one of the reasons is that as people embark on these projects, they come to recognize over time the level of complexity. And so they end up focusing on what they believe are the top use cases. Now, the top use cases are not always linked to what actually people are asking. It's just based on what they believe it to be. And for a lot of organizations that go down that path, maybe they'll look at the top 5, the top 10, and it turns out that when people come in, what we actually found is that humans are highly unpredictable in how they're going to say things and what they're going to look for. And that's generally what leads to failure. So kind of going back to a couple of slides ago, when people engage the first time and the virtual agent or the chatbot does not understand, there's no second chance.
Good point. And I would say identifying your top 10 problems that are coming into the service desk is still an excellent way to start, but that shouldn't necessarily be your ultimate end goal. And as Pat said, people are very inventive in how they come at these problems, to the point where it's somewhat terrifying. But so what is important to make your solution useful? How can you actually ensure that your chatbot solution succeeds in the long term and actually have people coming back to using it? The first point I wanted to leave you with is you should be seeking to reduce the amount of work you actually need to do to configure for each function or request. We said the top 10. And so as you expand out beyond that top 10, each and every one will accumulate more work and more training and maintenance associated with it. Making sure you don't have to do maximum amount of work for each one ensures that your project doesn't spiral out of control effectively. And on ongoing maintenance, this is required for language processing, action taking, identifying what and why there's actually missed intents or failing to deliver on an intent is fundamental for the ongoing improvement. And if people start changing how they're talking about something, like if a brand changes as part of your productivity suite, suddenly you have to retrain it along those lines and make sure that it understands that these are all still connected and not necessarily totally different entities. You need to be identifying what your solution is actually supposed to be used for, which is usually by and large fast and common requests. Choosing the top 10 frequent requests, as we said, repeatable, non-variable, is how we see some adopters keep at least the initial scope reasonable. And the faster you can scale outside of these top 10, the more effective you will be. But by and large, if you are trying to boil the ocean, you're by yourself even, you're going to be in for a very bad time. one of the other things you should be doing is ensuring that you actually provide a unified front end. And so you're not necessarily replicating internal silos. We talked to one CPG or worldwide CPG organization who had, I think it was about 13 different chat solutions internally that were effectively replicating internal silos. That was not effective, to say the least, because that ensured that people couldn't necessarily go to where they needed to go in order to get support. And finally, make sure that humans are still part of this conversation. Get a human should be supported by default for any solution. And after 2 failed interactions is usually what we recommend. That's when you automatically connect to a human agent. That ensures that no matter what the circumstances are, you are still fundamentally ensuring that your employees can get support, which is, again, the major goal or overall goal here. On maintenance, yes, this is just a flipped over number 8, but I think it's a fairly useful analogy because maintenance is kind of this awkward infinity loop of this varying intensity. So I want you to think about who actually does the maintenance of the solution, who keeps this up to date, who ensures that it's meeting the user's expectations. Is this internally managed? Is this through a service provider? Is this through the vendor? These are all key questions that you need to be asking yourself. And if you just think, oh, we can do it ourselves, understand that this is a significantly harder prospect than you might initially give it credit for, because how many people are going to think somebody's going to refer to Outlook as a blue taco? Sorry, not Outlook, OneDrive.
It's the 300K developer that's doing it. But being serious here, one of the challenges that we see is that software vendors are moving at a frantic pace, and a lot of new capabilities are being thrown at employees. And so some of the new stuff that's coming in are all these new features. So Zoom now has the ability to do a virtual background. Great. Well, people are going to be asking those questions. So it's really hard to stay ahead of what's happening in the industry.
That's a really good point. You might get questions like, what's our transcription policy for live communications if we're not necessarily, if we're not recording it, but we are transcribing it? What does that entail? You're going to be continuously, these solutions are continuously evolving, and you need to be prepared for that fundamentally.
Yep.
In how you can actually identify or measure for success, we wanted to provide you this quick overview. I'm not necessarily going to go over all of these line by line, but we encourage a balanced scorecard of measurement, because if you're just measuring for one specific area here, like just the intent recognition rate or the actual sort of number of deflection or deflected tickets, you're not necessarily going to be measuring the total effective impact on your organization and on your employees. Making sure that you both have intent recognition, drop conversations, numbers of interactions per user, the actual user MTTR, mean time to resolution for a specific task, that overall deflection rate, and total outcome score or an experience score of some equivalent. Making sure you have all 7 of those working in coordination and intention. Sorry, my apologies. All 6 of those in coordination and intention ensures you get a better understanding of how well your solution is actually serving your employees. To provide a few more best practices for this, your solution also isn't just based on technology. You actually need to ensure that you have cross-organizational input, including the people who will be using your solution. You'd be keeping this user experience and employee experience your top priorities for any instance here. If you're seeking to simply just reduce headcount, that won't work unless you also ensure that you can overcome the inertia of habit and actually make it useful to your users. Don't reinvent the wheel, as Pat said. There's a lot of different instances where you can just be redoing what other organizations have succeeded in. Please don't do that. It will only seek to lower your quality of life in this implementation. Plan a practical capability rollout. Make sure that you spend time on each one of these, as well as have a somewhat limited initial scope, because if you're, again, buoying the ocean, you're not necessarily going to succeed here, because you will be pulled in too many different directions at once in order to be effective in one. And again, as we just touched on a little bit, measure what really is ultimately mattering here. That's your user's success. If your users are being successful with your tool, ultimately they will probably have a better experience than if you're just measuring based on technical performance, because if you're very good at what your users don't need, they still won't use it. To provide just a quick understanding of how users might think of support today, they tend to see delay and then support as part of this interaction. One of the key ways you can start to change how you're thought of within the organization, how you can start reducing down that 60% of employees who might actually avoid your help desk, is through just directly getting people support, because people ultimately need a single place they know to go, they can go in order to get support that will ultimately get them to change their habit. Success allows you to then start adjusting behavior. And one of the questions that we pretty commonly get asked is phone support needed here? For certain organizations, yes, but by and large, we see people defaulting to phone, especially in instances where they know it's their way to get a hold of a person or to get support quickly. If you can prove that there are other channels in order to get support, that is a way to start moving people away from phone or away from things like email and more into things like chat or the like, which are usually even multi-agent in instances where they still do have to get a human. At the end of the day, it's, can you prove to users that you can provide them with an easy area to get success? Or sorry, easy area to get support, and that will lead you to success. My apologies, lost a few words there. But thank you all for joining me in my section of the presentation. And over to you, Pat.
Awesome, thanks, Will. If you could just go to the next slide. So just following up on what you just talked about, having a single place, the way that we look at the problem is really that, and I think you even mentioned this in your talk, we are creatures of habits. And if an employee has been calling for the past 15 years, they're just going to continue to call. If they've embraced Teams or Slack as the new collaboration tool as part of this hybrid workplace, then that's where they're going to go. But it's really hard to predict where people are going to go. But if you really want to maximize the adoption of the tool, you have to look at this from an omni-channel capability. You have to look at it in terms of meeting your employees where they are. When we were at ServiceNow and we built the service portal, what we came to understand is that people will not change their behavior for the convenience of the service desk. It just won't. But there's another aspect to a single place. The reality is employees do not understand the roles and responsibilities of different divisions and different departments or different teams. They just don't. They have their day job and that's what they focus on. When they have an issue with let's just say an IT application, perhaps it's Workday, SuccessFactors, doesn't really matter. How can they possibly understand whether a particular issue is an IT problem, an HR problem, or a finance issue? They just don't really understand. And so being able to go to one place, you were talking about this earlier, Will, the organization had 13 different chatbots. I mean, expecting an employee to know, well, this particular issue belongs here versus there is going to result in failure. But having a platform that really can understand the interaction and understand that an issue is really an IT issue versus a payroll issue versus an HR issue. And when automation can't be done or a deflection can't be done, route them to the appropriate team. That's how you deliver a great experience. And all of this has to be done with a great experience, and it has to be very fast. And if you could just go to the next slide.
There we go.
The way that we look at, thank you. The way that we look at kind of what is important when you're considering a virtual agent, it really comes down to 3 buckets. First and foremost, it's really about the resolution rate. The only reason why we're doing this is to maximize or minimize, I guess, the number of tickets that humans have to touch. Your service desk team members are super busy and you don't want them working on things that can be handled through a virtual agent. You want them focused on the complex issues, the things that really do require humans, and there's plenty of those. So what we typically see is if an implementation leverages the right technology, the language model understands, a sufficient amount of what employees are asking, you could achieve north of 60% deflection rates. But it's also about making sure that this platform has a continuous learning process. So as new capabilities come out in Zoom or Slack or Teams or what have you, that it already knows about that language so that you don't have to go back to your vendor or you don't have to go back to your team and start training all this new language, because it's really tough to go do that. It's also about making sure that you have a platform that you can go in and you can control if you want to. I think you were talking about this earlier, Will. Don't tell somebody how to reset a password, just reset the password for them. But to do that, you need to have a way to go and design these automations, connect to tools. And you could be connecting to anything that has a REST API. Maybe you're connecting to a tool like Workato, or maybe it's an RPA tool. Anything that could be accessed to leverage automation is something that you want to be able to connect the dots. But it's also about making sure that you're doing this in a place that understands the language of the enterprise. Again, don't expect your employees to have a bot for every individual department. So being able to have an omni-channel capability that understands multiple different languages and understands the language of all the different departments, make it easy for your employees. And finally, it's about having a platform that really is designed to work with you to maximize your return on your investment. The way that I look at it, just because of the way that I'm wired, is that it's my team's job to make sure that our customers are successful with our platform. And so the way that we design this is that my team is actually compensated on their success, which means that we're actually working with our customers to help them understand where the opportunities are from an automation standpoint to help them increase the level, essentially increase the number of deflections that they're seeing, again, reducing the amount of manual work that happens behind the scenes. So those are the three things that we typically see customers say are really important as they're making a decision of whether they're going to go down a build versus buy path. And hopefully this was helpful. So that's all I was going to share. Chris, I'm going to hand the ball back off to you for Q&A.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you both. We've gotten several questions in. I'm also aware that we're getting close to the top of the hour. So I'm going to pick one or two questions to ask you. I think the first one is, and whoever wants to answer this, Will, I think you might have a perspective. How do you deal with a moving scope for the conversational AI implementation?
Oh, yep, I can take that one. So that's actually something that we hear, unfortunately, fairly frequently from organizations, is that they're getting pulled in 1,000 different directions suddenly by this implementation. Somebody got wind that they're bringing in a chat solution, and suddenly it's going to solve all of their organization's problems. That's not the case. And as we said before, making sure you have a fairly banded scope to, at the very least, the initial implementation is fundamental to ensure that you're actually meeting those users' needs. And so one of the things that we tend to recommend is actually having a guiding team. It's very hard being pulled in a lot of different directions when you have really no authority to say no, when you don't have people whose full-time job it is to understand what's the scope in your organization, what you can actually do, and, for example, what vendors you should be engaging with. So actually having somebody at a more senior level or an executive level who's a sponsor of that, or somebody who at the very least has decision-making capability and authority to make decisions internally to say, we're going after these use cases, we're not going after these yet, but we'll be coming to you, and to actually ensure that you can meet the needs of where you're actually going, is a really good first step there. There will, of course, always be that tension, just because, as we saw, organizations need a lot of help when it comes to support, and there's always going to be immense appetite here. But by and large, having somebody who can say no is a really great first step in order to help stop some of that scope creep that we see everywhere.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And Pat, this is probably for you. How do we manage the different chatbots that we already have in our enterprise today? We've got, if they've got chatbots in HR and they might have 10 chatbots in HR, how do they manage that?
Yeah, that's what I call chatbot soup. So we do see a number of environments that we walk into where that is the case. What we typically would recommend is to leverage a single chatbot that can interact with all the different chatbots that have already been deployed, so that you're really increasing the value of the investment that you've made with these other chatbots. But over time, you will have to make a decision of where do you put your effort and your money, because every one of those chatbots requires some level of effort from a maintenance and all the stuff that Will talked about. And if you want to continue to increase the overall efficacy and the number of automations or the level of automation that you're actually seeing inside the organization, you're going to have to make a decision. So you can continue to manage 17 different language models, or you can over time start shifting towards a single virtual agent that can actually, and with one language model, that will actually be a lot easier for a team to handle. But Will, I'm kind of curious. I'm sure that you've seen a number of environments that that you're, at least customers that you've talked to, where they're dealing with the chatbot soup problem. And so how would you tell them how to get out of it, because the problem is once these things are designed, there's just an inherent maintenance cost. And if you multiply that by 10 or multiply it by 20, it's never going to be successful.
I very much agree. And we have unfortunately talked with a lot of organizations where that is the case. And so actually going back to the first question, having somebody who can say no or yes, that this is what we're going with, who can also fund these efforts, is really important there. We tend to see chatbot soup most commonly in organizations where there's nobody in control of the proliferation here, and where there's a lot of need, where there's a lot of different platforms that already include these, and where there's a lot of people with good ideas who want to genuinely help. Having people who can, again, control that is a first step here. And then we're also increasingly seeing features in platforms that are capable of doing something called orchestration, where you can actually directly then tunnel through one chatbot to another, and that actually helps control some of the tasking and flow there. That's definitely a lot more emergent today and isn't necessarily something that a lot of organizations will have, but that is something we recommend customers start asking about and what the plans are there. Ultimately, the answer should be reduce down, please reduce down the number of solutions you have that you're actively leveraging and choose a few strategic ones. But if there's internal politics where that's impossible, or everybody is way too enamored with their own solution, which does happen occasionally for good reason, usually, it's important to have some way to flex to meet that varying different organizational states that you might find yourselves in.
I think one of the points that you just raised, which is important to highlight here, is this is an opportunity for the CIO to basically take a role in dictating the organization's policy on virtual agents, because in the end, his team, his or her team, will end up being stuck with it over time.
Yeah,
and if I can get in this one last question, I see Will has already started looking at this one, and so I think it's an important one, and then we really will close. When you think about chatbots, how much time in our IT resources should be accounted for fine-tuning the bots? Does it depend on the number of employees and apps, et cetera?
That's a very good question. And to give the classic analyst response, it depends. So depending on the platform and depending on where the maintenance actually lives, that will vary. With that being said, at the very least, you want to have one person who can actually look over things like statistics in terms of success rates. But if you're going in and building this yourself, compared to purchasing a solution that is managed by a vendor or purchasing a solution that has components managed by the vendor, if you're doing it fully DIY, the number is going to be significantly larger. Funnily enough, the number of employees tends not to have that much of an impact there. Actually, the more employees you have, the more effective it'll be. There is a gradual sort of expansion of variation in terminology that you have as a result of having very large organizations, but a larger consideration should be number of languages used, as well as number of different regions supported, because that indicates usually far greater, I'll say, that will have more disparate answers depending on things like geographic relevance than just even a very large organization in one country versus a smaller organization in 10. The smaller organization in 10 will have a lot more of a complex environment that they need to manage for and will require significantly more management than the larger in a single location. Number of apps is another good point. Number of apps does directly tend to correlate to number of problems in some very odd math ways, but usually because of the number of different ways that a system can be referred to. And so if there are more systems that you are then ultimately responsible for, then it does directly correlate there. But again, really the biggest difference will be your approach here and your scope. If you are trying to take care of all employee-facing workloads by yourself doing a DIY approach, that will be a very large initiative, and we've seen organizations that have staffed up to like 90 different technicians for various different pieces of this for a mid-sized multinational manufacturing organization. For smaller organizations, or for organizations where they have a vendor managed solution, we've seen this team around like 3 people. So that's unfortunately why I have to give the "it depends" answer, but I hope that is helpful, and I hope that gives a little bit of perspective there into how this might actually look like in your organization.
That sounds great. And I know that we've got a webinar, a case study with Dexcom, which we call the gold standard of service desks. And Dennis from Dexcom talks about that very specific question. So it's on our website in the resources section if anybody is interested in that case study. And we'd love to answer the question in more detail. So just let us know. There's a demo request obviously available on the website as well.